At last, or oh no, another lockdown wargaming video. After months of experimentation, this was my first trial of using YouTube events to broadcast the video. This allows me to broadcast 3 simultaneous camera streams and lets the player choose their own view without compromising that of any other player. It also relieves me of the chore of running around the table to change the live view each time someone, you know who you are, bellows, "I can't see a thing!" To avoid infinite multiple audio feedback loops, I excluded sound from the recordings and we relied upon Skype as usual for the two-way communications. Thus, there's no live audio on this video. I hope to find a way around this for the next go. The battle played was the 1645 clash at Herbsthausen, a France versus Bavaria dust-up from the latter part of the 30 Years' War. This was one of Turenne's rare defeats and one of von Mercy's last wins. Colin Ashton has been suggesting to me that we might try Helion Publishing's In Deo Veritas rule set, and so we did. The scenario is taken pretty much verbatim from that available on the Helion website, with a couple of obvious changes. The rules author seems very wedded to 10 or 15mm scale troops and small tables. I have 28mm troops and a big table. I hope he's not too upset about this heresy. The Bavarians had the advantage in numbers and artillery, the French had an uphill position to defend, and the incalculable authority of the mercurial Dave Jarvis as Turenne. Dave and Sean commanded the French, Conrad, Nigel, Paul and John led the Bavarians. Colin audited proceedings and provided off-stage prompts. The players were located across the northeast of England. The table continued to reside in Lincolnshire. The Bavarians won the initiative roll for first turn and commenced with the expected general advance. In Deo Veritas divides an army into discrete commands, which it calls wings. The Bavarians had 4 wings, comprising the 2 lines of infantry in the centre and 2 wings of cavalry on the flanks. The French had only 2 wings, Turenne with amassed cavalry on their left, and Rosen with the infantry on the right and centre. The published rules use a deck of cards to randomly activate wings, but we decided to ignore that and stick with our usual policy of having the army commander nominate which of his wings was in play. As alluded to previously, the rules are targeted at 10 to 15mm troops. Units of horse and foot are universally called brigades, and all brigades have an identical frontage of 3 inches. Formations are abstracted into the base unit depiction. Thus, unlike lots of other rules, there is no attempt to differentiate between the location, behaviour and morale of individual blocks of pike or sleeves of shot. More on this later. As we were playing in 28mm, I modified this slightly, with all infantry brigades comprising 16 pike and 32 shot, with a frontage of 240mm, or about 9.5 inches. Cavalry brigades, we couldn't stop saying squadrons, were 12 figures on a 120mm or 4 3/4 inch frontage. The published move distances are very generous, so we didn't change them, but we extended small arms range out to 12 inches, which we think was a mistake. The Bavarians completed their turn by advancing their cavalry. Paul on the right headed straight to the foot of Turenne's Hill. The rules tell us to complete the movement for a brigade, including any charging and consequent tests, before moving on to the next unit. As this was turn 1 and no contact was possible, I just moved the entire wing as instructed by the players. Keen-eyed In Deo Veritas players will spot another deliberate error coming up. I, out of habit, moved the commander with the wing. And of course, moving commanders happens in its own phase at the end of a turn. Nigel, on the left, moved out to flank Rosen's position and attack his single paltry brigade of horse. In hindsight, this was where our mistake in extending the musketry range became apparent. Nigel was unable to bring his full weight of numbers to bear for fear of riding across the front of 2 infantry brigades and being shot into disorder or worse. As a result, Had two full brigades of cuirassiers that didn't really play a part in his attack, and Sean's solitary cavalry brigade was able to hold its own for far longer than expected. With In Deo Veritas, both sides complete their movement before the combat phase, which comprises both shooting and melee. The French retort started with Turenne's cavalry. Dave wanted to charge Paul's cavalry to his front. The rule is apparently straightforward, but threw up some questions that it took us a while to resolve. Dave's cavalry brigade can move to his opponent's control zone, which extends 3 inches to his front. Dave then tests on the disorder chart to see if his brigade's nerve holds, and he charges to contact. If he fails, his cavalry stay at 3 inches away from Paul's. If he passes, he moves into contact. Nothing complex there. However, a chunk of stuff ingrained in we grognards by our combined millennia of rules debates soon surfaced. Does Dave's cavalry conform to Paul's on contact? Remember, all brigade frontages are identical. Or does he do a shortest route move and then potentially part cover the opponent's frontage, allowing a second unit to attack the same unit? For the test to see if Dave's brigade closes to contact, the chart discusses secure flanks, but nowhere are secure flanks defined. Dave's cavalry is uphill of Paul's. When it comes to being shot at, being uphill has benefits in the rules, but there is nothing there about being uphill in either the test or the melee resolution rules. Is that deliberate or an omission? To these questions, there are common sense answers, win-at-all-cost gamer answers, and scenario-specific answers. But it would be nice, in a game involving 8 players of differing motivations and differing interpretative inclinations, to have the game designer's view. In this instance, we decided that the cavalry should conform, and that Dave's right flank probably was secure, as Paul's supporting cavalry would have to cross the frontage of Dave's supporting brigades to attack his flank. We dubiously agreed to shelve the uphill argument for the moment, and Dave took his test. He rolled his die, we totted up the factors, and success! His cavalry unit closed to contact with Paul's, who could be heard quietly but plaintively crying, "Countercharge!" Dave then proceeded to move the rest of his wing. Following the example in the book, he moved a supporting brigade first to ensure that when he moved his 3rd brigade into contact with the 2nd of Paul's front line brigades, his flank had been secured. He succeeded with his test, and he now had 2 brigades in melee with Paul's advancing wing. The rest of the brigade moved around in desultory fashion, and attention switched to Sean's flank. Sean did what any experienced wargamer would do when in command of a strong infantry force, arrayed uphill of an attacking opponent, when playing a set of rules for the first time, in the first turn of a game. As little as possible. In Deo Veritas defines fire lanes for brigades that can shoot, which are simply straightforward extensions of the brigade's flank edges. Other games might call this the beaten zone. To shoot an enemy brigade, there must be nothing between the shooting brigade and the target within this fire lane. Sean therefore aligned his right flank infantry brigade to ensure that Nigel's cavalry must be viable targets. He then pulled back his sole cavalry brigade, forcing Nigel's attack to proceed through a mini valley of death. Classic Sean. We now proceeded to the combat phase. This is where shooting and melee take place. Shooting first, in which both sides' fire is treated as happening simultaneously. Then melee, in the order chosen by the player with the initiative. In the historical battle, the Bavarian artillery devastated the French brigades on the hill and contributed heavily to the result. Clearly, Conrad wasn't throwing their 2 hit dice. Each shooting unit has a number of shooting dice, and each target has a number of saving dice. A variety of influencing factors are considered, but rather than change the value to hit or to save, In Deo Veritas adds or reduces the number of dice thrown. When the dice are rolled, a 4 or better is always the result the player wants. Unsaved hits are marked, in our case with casualty bases, and lead to immediate disorder tests. Shooting continued down the line, without causing too much disruption. The game was not in itself slow, but we could have speeded things up by keeping the shooting distances at their original published values and concentrating on the manoeuvring for the first couple of turns. The shooting complete, we resolve the melees. The player with the initiative, in this case the Bavarians, chooses the order of resolution. As in both cases in this turn it was the French who had moved into contact, or charged as you might say, this seemed a little counterintuitive, but we got on with it. As with shooting, each side gets a base number of attack dice and saving dice, dependent upon troop type. Quality, experience, and other environmental factors increase or decrease the number of dice until the final tally is arrived at, and the fight begins, with both players rolling for 4s or better. In the first case, Paul's Bavarians inflicted 2 unsaved hits on Dave's Frenchmen and received none in reply. The combat resolution table decreed that Dave's cavalry, having lost by 2, were routed and must make a rout move away from the enemy. Paul's victorious brigade must test for impetuous pursuit. So far, so normal. However, close examination of the rules revealed the first and the major headache we uncovered. A cavalry brigade's rout move is 27 inches. The rules for impetuous pursuit clearly define 2 conditions for the test. Firstly, that the potential target must be visible, and secondly, that it must end its move within 18 inches of the potential pursuer. We read and reread and searched the rules high and low for the clauses or examples that we must be missing, but eventually concluded that the rules clearly state that, in a cavalry fight, the winner can never pursue the loser because the loser will rout further than the maximum allowed distance for the test, unless some obstacle prevents the router from completing its move. This cannot be what the author intended. The propensity for cavalry of all ages to go herring off in pursuit of a beaten foe is beyond dispute. All rules allow for this, and have different mechanisms by which the owning player can try to restrain them from doing so in order to keep the advantage. Given that the impetuous pursuit rule is there in the first place, I can only surmise that either we have not competently read and interpreted the rules, or that the rules have been mangled in the editing process and some unintended consequence has occurred. As it stood, Paul's victors occupied the ground given up by Dave, and we moved to the next fight. The combatants and factors were identical, and this time so was the dice rolling. A draw, which meant that the fight continued in the following turn. We agreed that, as this was supposed to be a brigade fight, though we kept saying squadron, that the charges, rallies, and counter-charges you would expect in a cavalry fight were all being abstracted into the combat resolution process. The remainder of the turn was taken up by the morale phases. First, each unit with a degree of disorder could attempt to rally themselves. This process quickly revealed the value of close support, both from friendly units and from commanders. After this phase, any wings containing routed brigades have to test for fatigue. Finally, if the army has any fatigued wings, it must test on the general "we're buggering off" table. This can be a bit hairy, as we discovered when Dave avoided having the Great Turenne leg it after only 2 turns by 1 pip on a die. Turn 1 completed without any wings becoming fatigued, and with most disorders, though not Dave's rout, being recovered. The Bavarians won the initiative again, and turn 2 commenced. I forgot to say at the start that each wing is given one of 3 orders at the start of a turn: attack, hold, or withdraw. Needless to say, the Bavarian wings were all on attack orders, as was Turenne's cavalry wing. Sean had his wing on hold orders for the entirety of the game. We leave the game for now, with the initial Bavarian moves for Turn 2 in progress. Tune in later for Part 2 of the video report, where the result of the game is determined, other rule situations are discussed, and I report our overall view of In Deo Veritas upon first contact. Cheers for now, Steve.